Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pedro Mzileni. I'm a research assistant in the chair for critical studies in higher education transformation. Welcome to this seminar series called Redirections, Ukutshintshwa kweendlela, which is one of the programs that we run as CriSHET in partnership with any other stakeholder in the university that is interested in building an intellectual culture in the university. We are hosting this seminar this afternoon in partnership with the Faculty of Law, and I also want to give those colleagues a warm welcome. This afternoon we have a scholar that I respect so much, Umkhuluwa, Dr. Tshepo Madlingozi. And just to give a brief bio of who Tshepo is, he completed his PhD from Birkbeck University, or Birkbeck, which is the University of London. And currently he's a senior lecturer in the Department of Jurisprudence at the University of Pretoria. His other cap as well is that he's also an extraordinary senior lecturer at Stellenbosch University, where he is based there in the Department of Public Law. We have also recently scoped him, where he is a research associate for CriSHET as well. We hope to see you around often, my leader. It's a long bio. Let me cut it short and say he is the co-editor of African Human Rights Law Journal, and he's also part of the management team in the Pretoria University Law Press. That is basically the profile of Dr. Tshepo Madlingozi, who is with us this afternoon. It's not the Madlingozi that is on the list. This is Tshepo. All right. The talk for this afternoon is titled "Decolonization is always a disruptive phenomenon on social movements and the decolonial turn in constitutional history." Very interesting title for the talk. And this is what abstract is. Let me not hesitate or waste any time by handing it over to you, Nkosiam, to give the lecture. Thank you.
Can you hear me there? Is it working? Okay, I don't know whether to stand or I feel like I'm about to play the cello. Is it better if I stand? Okay, I'm not used to this kind of setting. First of all, let me thank all of you for coming on this beautiful Friday. You could be sitting by the beach in Cubana somewhere, but you chose to be here, so thank you for coming. Secondly, I want to thank Andre, Professor Kit, and the team here at CriSHET. I've been here for just under 2 weeks, and I felt very, very much welcome. Thank you so much. And of course, as Pedro said, I've been appointed as the research associate. Therefore, I look forward to coming here more. And we've already discussed a number of projects, and I look forward to those projects. Okay, so the title of the talk has already been given to you. I first want to start by making 2 prefatory remarks. The first remark is that this talk is a critique of decolonization and decoloniality discourses that are happening at various universities. So I assume it's an assumption from my side that it is about and that it's already being unfolding here. So what I'm doing is not an introduction to decoloniality. I hope all of us know what we're talking about. I'll be doing a critique. So I've got that assumption. The second thing that I need to say is that, and this relates to this first part of the title, decolonization is always a disruptive phenomenon. There is no decolonization without disruption. I hope you all agree with that. And decolonization is always disruptive because in the first place, decolonization is about democracy. We sometimes forget that the struggle for decolonization has its end goal, democracy. Decolonization is disruptive because it is about democracy. Now, what is the link between decolonization, disruption, and democracy? If we agree with Santos' take that, and I quote here, the democracy is the entire process through which unequal power relations are replaced by relations of shared democracy, end of quote. We are bound, let me wait for people to sit down first. Okay, everybody settled. No more disruption. So I was explicating on the relationship between democracy, decolonization, and disruption. And I said if we start with Santos' explication of what democracy is, Santos being Boaventura de Souza Santos, in a scholar, a decolonial scholar, he describes democracy as follows. Democracy is the entire process through which unequal power relations are replaced by relations of shared democracy. If we agree with that explication, we are bound to agree that there is no democracy and democratic coexistence without contestations, debate, and therefore disruption. French philosopher Jacques Rancière gives even a better explication of the relationship between democracy and disruption. Jacques Rancière, he does this in a essay called Introducing Disagreement, and this is how he explains it. The word demos designates those who are outside the count. Democracy meant the power of the people with nothing. The speech of those who should not be speaking. Those who are not really speaking. Democracy is a disruption of all logics that purport to find domination on some entitlement to dominate. Today, when the tension between democracy and capitalism have all disappeared, where democracy and coloniality sing the same tune, disruption and disruptions are more needed than ever. More pertinently, given this confluence and conjuncture between democracy and capitalism, democracy, or what Fela Kuti, the Afrobeat pioneer, calls demonocracy, and coloniality, democracy itself must be disrupted. Democracy itself must be disrupted. Let me come to the point and bring it back to South Africa and the higher education sector. Who indeed can disagree that in this time when decolonization and decoloniality has descended into a series of memes? Is it meme or memes? Meme. Memes. It's meme. No, it's meme. Bumper stickers and meaningless metaphors where decoloniality scholarship has been appropriated by careerist academics, where it's been cannibalized by university management. Who can disagree that the time has come for decoloniality itself to be disrupted if it is to achieve its goals of epistemological parity, interculturality, and human liberation? Decoloniality has been captured. Decoloniality itself must be disrupted. Okay, so in this talk, I seek to return to a 2006 paper of mine, 2006, Legal Academics and Progressive Politics in South Africa, Beyond the Ivory Tower. And I want to make 3 provocations today. 1, decolonization is always a disruptive phenomenon. 2, decolonization and decoloniality scholars ought to move beyond the ivory tower if they are serious about contributing to the decolonization of law, society, and the polity. And the final point that I wish to make today is that certain social movements of impoverished people, movements whom Jack Rancière would describe as movements, or those who don't count, what Fanon will call movements of the damned of the earth. These movements of disruptions have been engaged with what we can call decolonization from below. I argue, therefore, that there is much to learn from these movements. Indeed, as shall be clearer later on, I do not believe that decolonization and decoloniality is decolonization the same thing. It's not the same thing. I look forward to the debate. Decolonization, decoloniality, are they the same thing? We'll talk about that. I argue that decolonization and decoloniality, whether within the university or in society, cannot be enacted, cannot be realized from above. It needs to come from below. Okay? So those are the three propositions that I wish to make. And I will make them in three movements. The first movement is that I will chart the contours of the decolonial turn in constitutional theory. Secondly, I will highlight some pitfalls and contradictions in decolonial theory itself, and therefore argue that decolonial scholarship must be disrupted, must be itself be decolonized, decolonial scholarship. And then finally, I will focus on the disruptive struggles of Abahlali baseMjondolo, with specific reference to how these movements seek to instantiate decolonization from below. So that is the introduction and that's the overview. I need to make one apologia. I take this talk from an intensive course that I gave in Palestine over 2 weeks. So here I'm going to try to condense this course into a paper, okay? And therefore I'll strive for some coherence, but if there are things missing, if I say too many things parenthetically or elliptically, please bear with me. Okay, the first section. What is a decolonial turn in constitutional theory? I'm a lawyer, therefore I want to focus on constitutional theory. And I hope it will be relevant for all of us. It must be relevant for all of us because indeed the Constitution suffuses everything for good and for bad. None of us can avoid the Constitution. Therefore, this discussion on the decolonial turn in constitutional theory applies to all of us. Are you okay, Kadas? Okay. Okay, first section. Decolonization, as you know, the decolonization approach to constitutional law gained mainstream visibility after the 2015 and 2016 fees must fall struggles. Gained visibility. Doesn't mean they were not there before, but students gave it more impetus, the decolonial turn in constitutional theory. For us to understand the decolonization turn in constitutional theory, we first need to distinguish it from liberal approaches to constitutionalism, as well as traditional critical thoughts on constitutionalism. Decolonization is different from liberal approaches, but it's also different from traditional critical schools of thought. And it's important for, if we are to understand the decolonial turn, for us to understand this distinction. Let me start with the liberal critique of the Constitution. Liberal critiques tend to adopt an institutional critique of the Constitution. What do I mean by this? Liberal scholars tend to argue that the reason why constitutional promises have not been realized in reality is because the courts is the fault of the courts. The courts have adopted a conservative legal culture. The courts, in their mode of adjudication, how they read the cases, they adopt a very conservative legal culture, and therefore we are unable to realize this good, the promises of this good constitution, what people call transformative constitutionalism. Another set of liberal critics put the spotlight on another institution, the state. And they say, you know what, the reason why we've got this disjuncture between constitutional promises and the reality on the ground is because the state fails to implement very good court decisions. That is the fault of the black ruling class. The black ruling class have betrayed constitutional promises. There's nothing wrong with the constitution, but what is wrong is that the black ruling class have messed up the constitution. Now here is the most important point. Liberal critics do not resist the call for the wide-scale amendment of the constitution. They don't want that. They don't want a wide-scale amendment of the constitution. Instead, they argue that the constitution is a living document, and as such, social actors and the courts will transform it into a beautiful reality, okay? But they resist amendments to the constitution. In fact, liberal scholars deify the constitution. They see the constitution as a god, okay? They see the constitution as a god, the deification of the constitution. So those are liberal scholars. The second distinction that we need to make is between decolonization scholarship and critical legal scholars. Now, critical legal scholars do not deify the constitution. They don't see the constitution as God. They don't subscribe to the myth of judicial neutrality, okay? They don't subscribe to the fallacy that there's a distinction between law and politics. In fact, critical scholars argue that the constitution has not dismantled, or that it is incapable of dismantling power relations that cause sustained racism, homophobia, patriarchy, and so forth. However, critical scholars do not call for a post-conquest constitution. They don't call for the abolishment of the constitution. Rather, critical scholars seek to rescue the constitutional project. They argue that the constitution, in 1994, we had a good transition, but we need to rescue it. How do we rescue it? By reading the constitution from a race perspective, critical race scholars, from a feminist perspective, or from a queer perspective. So they argue that in order to rescue the constitution, we need to insert a race, a queer, and a feminist lens in order to achieve social justice. They don't want a post-conquest constitution. Now let's come to the decolonial approach to the constitution. The decolonial approach to the constitution is a movement, and as such, we differ amongst ourselves. But we are united by two fundamental pillars, decolonial critiques of the constitution. Two pillars unite this movement. The first pillar is that 1994 did not herald the era of decolonization. The argument here is that white domination transmuted into white hegemony. 1994 did not lead to decolonization. Instead, what happened is that white domination transmuted into white hegemony with assimilating a few black elites and therefore masking change. While the majority of citizens, let's call them subjects, are still pariahs in South Africa. The second fundamental pillar of the decolonial term is that this dispensation that some scholars called a ongoing conquest, a situation of ongoing conquest, while others call it a situation of neo-apartheid, is constituted and constitutes post-1994 constitutionalism. So the idea here is that the constitution itself is imbricated perpetuates ongoing conquest. So those are the two pillars. One, 1994 did not lead to decolonization. And number two, that the Constitution itself is often constitutes this ongoing conquest. Following from these two pillars, decolonization scholars call for a post-conquest constitution. Decolonial scholars call for a post-conquest constitution. Now, what is a post-conquest constitution? How would a post-conquest constitution look like? I've written this in another paper, but I can just summarize 3 pillars of a post-conquest constitution. There are 3 fundamental pillars of a post-conquest constitution. Number 1, such a constitution needs to dismantle the colonial state form and therefore the eternal subjugation of indigenous sovereignties. South Africa state is still a colonial state form. It is founded on the basis of the subjugation of indigenous kingdoms, right? In 1897, the Bambata Rebellion, the condition of possibility for South Africa to emerge in 1910 was the subjugation of indigenous kingdoms. That subjugation continues today, right? That subjugation continues. So the first thing that a post-conquest constitution needs to do is to dismantle the colonial state form. The second thing that it needs to do, a post-conquest constitution, is to dismantle the entrenchment of a world of apartness. Apartheid is gone, but the world of apartness continues. A world where some people are invisible and some people are visible. A world where some people live in what Fanon will call the zone of beings and the zone of non-beings continues today. The Constitution has failed to resolve the national question. What is the national question today? So the second thing that a post-conquest constitution needs to do is to address the national question. The national question is an ongoing imperative in South Africa today. Finally, a post-conquest constitution needs to attend to the continuation of the subordination of African life worlds, African epistemologies, African legalities. South Africa is supposed to be free, but African life worlds, African ways of being in the world continue to be subjugated. If you want to practice customary law, it needs to abide by the Constitution. Now, some people say, but that's fine, the Constitution is neutral. Is the Constitution culturally neutral? Is the Constitution civilizationally neutral? The Constitution is not. It's a Euro-modern liberal document. And therefore, if you say, if you want to practice customary law, you must abide by the Constitution. This continues the marginalization, the inferiorization of African life worlds, African ways of being in the world. So those are the 3 things that a post-conquest constitution needs to do. To recap, the 2 fundamental pillars of the decolonial turn in constitutional theories are 1, 1994 did not lead to a post-colonial society. In this understanding, we cannot talk about a post-apartheid jurisprudence. There's no post-apartheid jurisprudence. We rather can talk about the neo-apartheid jurisprudence. We can debate that in the questions. The second thing that decolonial scholars say is that the current constitution is constituted by and constitutes a situation of ongoing conquest or neo-colonialism or neo-apartheid. The solution is not more transformative constitutionalism. The solution is a post-conquest Constitution. So far, so good? The hard part has passed. The constitutional part has passed. Section 2, the pitfalls of decolonial scholarship. The pitfalls of a decolonial scholarship. So there is a decolonial scholarship. I've highlighted what it says about the Constitution, but it has a lot of pitfalls. And here I'm going to randomly pick 4 pitfalls of a decolonial scholarship. The first pitfall is the most obvious one. Most decolonial scholars in South Africa over-rely on concepts and theories that come from elsewhere. Yes? Theories that come from Latin America, theories that come from Black America. Now, Edward Said, the Palestinian-American scholar, once asked, can theory travel? Can theory made from certain condition, can it travel to other conditions? That debate continues. However, for our purposes, decolonial scholars do not tell us how these theories can travel to South Africa. So people just cut and paste theories from Latin America, from Black America, and parachute them here without saying why we can make that comparison. They fail to show us this strategy of what we can call conceptual borrowing. Conceptual borrowing. They fail to show how this strategy complements or hinders the twin decolonization imperative of 1, conceptual decolonization, and then 2, the imperative to excavate and valorize our own subjugated norms, proverbs, and so forth. There is no decolonization without conceptual decolonization, right? Otherwise, what you do is that you think you're doing decolonization, but the concept that you use, the concept of time, time in African cosmology is different from time in Western cosmology. In Western cosmology, time is linear. In African cosmology, time is cyclical. So if you just use those concepts without decolonizing them, you are continuing colonization. The concept of being, of a human being, is very different from how we understand a human being in African humaneness and from Western. So the first important thing that decolonization needs to do is to conceptually decolonize. And I'm arguing that the strategy of borrowing concepts from elsewhere hinder this strategy of conceptual decolonization. The other thing, of course, that decolonization needs to do is to excavate our own proverbs, our own norms that have been subjugated. Our proverbs have a lot to teach us, have a lot of work to do in decolonizing the law, for example. I mean, if you take the concept of the concept that says an injustice is always an injustice until it is rectified. That's a powerful proverb. We need to excavate those proverbs. But how does the strategy of borrowing from other places clash with this? So that's the first thing. That's the first pitfall of decolonial scholarship. Over-reliance on theories that come from elsewhere. The second pitfall of decolonization scholarship is that some decolonization scholars fail to undertake a critical historical analysis. A critical historical analysis. Therefore, you read a lot of decolonization books, articles, that make a lot of ahistorical mistakes. Because they fail to situate our project in a deep understanding of history. You can see how this pitfall is related to the first pitfall. Therefore, you find some scholars who take analysis from other parts of the colonized world, from Latin America, from Black America, or from countries that had colonialism, but do not have settler colonialism, and they impose those theories here. You can't do that. Settler colonialism and colonialism are quite different. A failure to undertake deep, critical, historical research. You see this in inaccurate analysis that people make about the relationship between missionaries, anthropologists, and colonialists. They look at what happened to colonialists, anthropologists, and missionaries in other parts of Africa and think the same thing happened here. It played out differently here. The relationship between missionaries, anthropologists, and colonialists. But the other, much more interesting, ahistorical mistakes that we see is this tendency to conflate apartheid and colonialism. Apartheid is not colonialism. Colonialism is not apartheid. Yes or no? You disagree? I want us to debate that. People talk about colonial apartheid. Apartheid and colonialism were quite two distinct modes of governmentality. And the failure to undertake critical historical research leads to the conflation of apartheid and colonialism. Is apartheid the same as colonialism? Masikulu. The third pitfall of decolonial scholarship is that a sizable percentage of decolonial scholars focus on the compromises that were made in the lead up to democracy, the compromises that the ANC made. All decolonial scholars, whether in law, in sociology, in history, in politics, tend to focus on the compromises that were made from 1989. Right? In this regard, and here's a pitfall, some critics overemphasize structural factors, thus denying the agency of ANC actors. So they'll say, for example, people compromise because the wall fell. You know the wall? After the wall fell, they had to compromise, therefore overemphasizing the structural factors. Or some of them overemphasize the agency of this actor so that they can sell the sell-out narrative. So they overemphasize the agency of ANC actors so they can say, this guy sold out. Neither the structural factors nor the agency needs to be overemphasized. We need to be more nuanced. Third pitfall of decolonization scholarship. The last one, and perhaps most important. Seemingly decolonial projects that claim to be radical, that claim to be decolonial, fall into the trap that is set by colonialists. They fall into the trap that has been set by colonialists. How do they do that? You see it in three ways. The first way is that what is supposed to be radical critiques, decolonial critiques, they repeat colonialist ideas about the inherent difference between black and white. Similarly, radical critiques repeat the colonialist idea that there's a difference between the black race and the white race. That's a trap. That's a trap. Any decolonial project, any radical project that has its own end goal, not its tactic, but its strategy, its end goal, the retrieving of the black race, is a mistake. Who created the concept of race? I usually play a game with my first year students, and I say to them, who is the father and who is the child? Or who is the mother and who is the child? Is it race? Is race the father of racism? Or is racism the father of race? What came first, race or racism? If you don't understand what came first, you are going to fall into a colonist trap. People talk about the inherent difference between black and white. The second thing, you see people talking about the uniqueness of black culture. What is black culture? That's an invention of colonialists. It's an invention of colonialists, and you fall into that trap, talking about the essential difference between black culture and it's important. They don't talk about white culture, they talk about European culture. Yes? You see this this is a reprise, this is a repeat of old negritude. Remember negritude? Remember a guy called Senghor? What's his first name? Leopold Senghor, the first president of Senegal, and one of the three founders of negritude. Say there's something called the black culture. And you say, what is this black culture? What is these unique qualities? Music, culture, openness. No, that's not true. We are not reducible to music and things like that. There is no unique black culture. So seemingly radical decolonial critique repeat this thing about black culture and white culture. Thirdly, the trap that people fall into and the trap that is set by colonialists. You see people talking about the need to retrieve native discourse. Native discourse. What is that? Or the need to retrieve native cultures. You see people calling themselves natives, proud natives. Who creates the native? The native only comes into existence once the settler arrives. The native comes into existence only when the settler arrives. Now, are you going to call yourself native forever? Who were you before the settler arrived? But most importantly, when people say we need to retrieve native discourses, they are using the colonial library. They are using what Mudimbe calls the colonial library. Look at the footnotes. The footnotes is anthropologists, missionaries. That's where native discourse was formulated. Remember the book by Mudimbe, The Invention of Africa. How did Africa come into being? How did African discourse come into being? From the colonial library. So that's the fourth pitfall of decolonial scholarship. The repeat of colonials' ideas about black and white, about black culture, and its essential characteristics, and the need to retrieve native discourse. You also see the black radicals' colonial mentality. The black radicals' colonial mentality in always trying to shame historical colonizers. So people will repeat anti-black discourses that the black is not human, that the black cannot coexist with humanity. You see people repeating that in certain black radical thought. The idea is to shame colonizers. The idea is not self-determination, but it's still aggressive dependency on the settler, on the colonialist. You see this in certain strands of Afro-pessimism, very popular in South Africa today, in vogue, fashionable, Afro-pessimism. You see this tendency. The important point here is that decoloniality itself needs to be decolonized. Itself needs to be disrupted. Let's move on. Now, those of you who are woke, those of you who are Fanonian scholars will have noticed that the first part of the title comes from somewhere. It comes from the first line in Fanon's last book, The Damned of the Earth, the chapter on violence, and it begins, decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. I didn't use the word violent. I don't want to get CriSHET into problems. Decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. What is the relationship between decolonization and violence? Or more precisely, is disruption always violent? Indeed, what constitutes violence? What about the violence of Western modernity? What about the violence of liberal democracy? The violence of capitalism? Indeed, the violence of a Eurocentric neoliberal university. A Eurocentric liberal university perpetuates violence. What about that violence? I'm told that I've got 5 minutes, so I'm going to skip a lot. But the point is that the curriculum transformation and decolonization projects that are happening in most universities would not have been possible if it was not for the students. It would not have been possible if it was not for the disruption that were caused by the students. Today, decoloniality and decolonial scholarship has been decoupled from contestation, protest, and debate. Specifically, you never see students in all of these decolonization projects. Students have been excluded from this, even though the students were the first ones to start this. They've been excluded. Let's put it more clearly. In most instances and endeavors undertaken in the name of decoloniality, those projects have themselves become violence. Indeed, many decolonial academics are cultural imperialists who carve their decolonial scholarship away from society, away from students. They're decolonial academics, but they're cultural imperialists. Most decolonial scholars do not believe they have nothing, they have anything to learn from society, to learn from students. They've erected internal and external ivory towers between themselves and the students, but they're decolonial academics. This takes me to my last provocation. Decolonization and decoloniality scholars ought to move beyond this internal and external ivory tower. Internally within the universities, academics have created the ivory tower, but between themselves and society, decolonial scholars have also created an ivory tower. I want to argue that when Fanon proclaimed that decolonization is always a violent phenomenon, he not only meant disruption and disobedience should be directed at hegemonic epistemologies, but he also meant that disruption and violence need to be internal. We need to disrupt ourselves, first of all. We need to decolonize our minds. A lot of us are decolonial academics, but we are still mentally colonized. We need to disrupt our minds. I'm skipping a lot. I don't want to get into trouble with Petro. Final section. In this final section, I wish to show that certain social movements of impoverished people have been engaged in what we can call decolonization from below, and that the decolonial scholars ought to learn from these movements if they wish to decolonize society and the university. By the way, there is no decolonized university in a colonized society, right? There is no decolonized university in a colonized society. Therefore, if people are serious about achieving decolonization of the university, they also need to move beyond the ivory tower. Is it possible for academics to move beyond the ivory tower? We don't know. Okay, I wanted to talk about Abahlali baseMjondolo. Abahlali baseMjondolo is a movement based in Durban, about 50,000 members. Is it 50,000? Yeah, 50,000 members all over the country now, but started in Durban, that campaigns for the rights of shack dwellers. And I argue that we have a lot to learn from these social movements. But I'm also highlighting these social movements because there's a tendency to talk about decolonization, to talk about the need for a post-conquest society, without telling us who must bring this about. Who are these political subjects that are supposed to lead us to a post-conquest society? There's a fifth pitfall of decolonial scholarship. Do you know Abahlali? Yes or no? You do? Okay, I'll just summarize quickly. I want to make the case that Abahlali baseMjondolo and his allies is engaged in what you can call decolonization from below by focusing on 4 elements of their repertoire. The first one is that Abahlali is very different from most social movements of impoverished people. They distinguish themselves in this way. They seek to decolonize the native settler relations that manifest in a situation where historical settlers continue to own a large share of the land. Right? Native settler relations continue. And Abahlali are engaged in dismantling that. How are they engaged in dismantling that? They disregard property rights. They set up their shacks where they want to check up their land, their shacks. In fact, they are engaged in land reform from below. So that's the first way in which Abahlali is engaged in decolonization, a disruption of property relations and of property rights. Most social movements are not interested in that. They just want basic services. Secondly, the location of many Abahlali settlements are not in the black townships. Rather, their settlements are on the edge of the city. If you go to Durban, you will see that their settlements are not in the townships. They're on the edge of the city. In this way, Abahlali refuse their colonialization in the black township. Indeed, Abahlali's notion of the right to the city, of spatial justice, will lead to the dissolution of the townships and the suburbs. Most notions of the right to the city, of spatial justice, are about upgrading shack settlements or about not evicting people from inner city. Well, you can do that, but if you do that, the townships and the suburbs remain there. Spatial apartheid remains. Abahlali seek to dissolve this spatial apartheid. Thirdly, Abahlali seeks to decolonize democracy by insisting on what they call home-made democracy, which is constituted by a deep understanding of internal democracy. And also Abahlali refuse to be co-opted by academics and NGOs. They completely refuse that. In this way, they refuse to be co-opted into hegemonic epistemology. They are decolonizing epistemologies. In fact, Abahlali has set up what they call Abahlali, so the University of Abahlali. They've set up their own university. Decolonization from below. Finally, Abahlali seek to disrupt and decolonize constitutional law by approaching it tactically, never strategically. What I mean by this is that Abahlali refuse to be called a human rights organization because they understand that their problems are not the problems of constitutionalism, of rights. They are the problems of democracy, of politics. So a refusal to be co-opted into a human rights discourse, into a social justice discourse that leads to assimilation. This is decolonization from below. Full stop.
All right. Thank you very much, Tshepo, for that address. I will now open it to the floor immediately. We'll just take 2 rounds of 5 hands. I now hand it over to the floor. Can I be assisted with roaming mics at the back, please? All right.
No questions.
Captured.
Now they come up.
Number 1, Yona. Number 2, my leader. 3, 4, 5. So we are round 2, in that order.
Thank you very much. I think everybody can pretty much hear me. It's more of a comment and a question at the same time, so let's just roll with it. Firstly, when we define student-led movements, we usually define them under the bracket of alternative politics, right? So in that definition, within the context of decoloniality and decolonization of constitutional theory and institutional understandings of politics, can we then say that alternative politics really is the alternative when we're referring to decolonization as a whole, especially when it comes to institutional dynamics? Secondly, we refer to a gender-based and feminist orientation in regards to decolonial theory and institutional theory when it comes to the Constitution specifically. Now, under the context of legal rational law or customary law as well, do we then think that the visibility of queer bodies, especially in student-led movements again, is something that we need to prioritize, especially when we consider the binary of the other versus the self? So in terms of that, do we then look at accommodating other bodies and not terming them as the other themselves, especially in this context, and then moving forward towards creating a more pluralistic approach as opposed to the one already created in the democratic liberal tradition? Thank you.
Well, I think mine is quite simple and straightforward, we are actually debating all this within the context of the university right now. And I think most of us would like to see how decolonization can actually make sense within the education, within our institution. But what I've actually realized is that there are quite a number of voices within the university. Some of those voices you've mentioned. You've mentioned the academics and the different types of academics. The liberals, those who are more transformative, and those who are radical. Those are different kinds of voices that we're talking about. But we also have voices from the students themselves. But the students do not actually speak one voice. There are different voices that seem to emerge from the students themselves. We also have administrative structures within the university. We have workers. We have the broader community. All those are various voices within the need to do or to be engaged in decolonialism or in decoloniality. How do you put all these together in order to achieve what might be the ideal decolonized structure within the university?
Hello, I'm Lemogang Modisakeng. I am a lecturer at the Center for Philosophy in Africa. And my research is in philosophy, and in particular in Setswana oral philosophy, so it's interesting that you mentioned it. I'm just interested to know what your take is on creating conceptual schemes that are uniquely and organically African through the English language. Because in my research, I find that a lot of the times, there are a lot of phrases in dispute, right? Because obviously, given the Eurocentric language that is English, it has its own paradigm and it has its own conceptual scheme, which is evident in its language. So when you begin to theorize Setswana proverbs and Setswana oral tradition through the English language, you begin to lose some of the meanings. And further, what Lyotard speaks about in the different, specifically when it comes to phrases in dispute in law, is that you'll have phrases that are in direct dispute. For example, in Setswana, monna le mosadi, right, are not the direct equivalent of man and woman in English, right? So when you have phrases in disputes like those, and you're using an English language which follows an English conceptual scheme and paradigm, you are already giving into that paradigm as your frame, and therefore positioning it as the authority. So, do you think that we should just theorize in African languages when we do create African conceptual schemes? Do you think it's even possible to decolonize in an English language? And where would that leave the academic project? Because knowledge is about sharing, it's about translatability, it's about understanding. So, how do we do that?
Colleagues, there's just a plea from CNN that when you speak, could you rise so that you are able to be captured on TV? Thanks.
So I was hoping you could clarify the distinction that you made between decolonial thinking and the critical approach. So or the tendency in the critical approach to view things from like a race or a feminist or a queer perspective. So I was wondering if, aren't those approaches a form of decolonization? Like, is it not challenging the traditional structures of what it means to be a human being? Because they've already been. Okay, so I guess that's the question.
It's clear.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Molefi Porero. I just basically would like to pose a question to Dr. Tshepo Madlingozi. Do you think, I know normally we talk about decolonization, but I think we mainly address it from the white versus the black point of view. But I just want to stress that even before, if I give an example of a settler date here in South Africa in 1652, before we heard of the Decolonial wars and all of that, so it means that there was already a realization that I don't know if it was superiority or I don't know, whatever, because we know that as we live here in Southern Africa, our ancestors, for example, as the Zulu, Xhosa, Tswana, they are from the Great Lakes region, of which is the Burundi or DRC and Cameroon, So my question to you, and now as we live in South Africa, Botswana, wherever, in SADC, we now speak of tribalism. So I just want to pose a question to you, Dr. Madlingozi, to say, do we speak of decolonization, or perhaps isn't it long overdue to introduce the whole concept of detribalization? Or perhaps is it time for us to introduce what is probably going to be a middle ground, I don't know, for some new term, which is going to assimilate the two? Because there's no point in us fighting decolonization or achieving decolonization, and yet there's still tribalism. We're going to decolonize, but then there's still going to be that difference. The Zulus or maybe the Xhosas are going to feel like they're more superior to the other ethnic groupings. So isn't it perhaps we engage in a three-pronged approach whereby we engage from a process of detribalization versus decolonization, so that by the time we achieve decolonization, then we don't have a challenge of superiority complex?
All right. Tshepo, difficult questions. I wish you all the best in answering them. Over to you.
No, we are together here.
Sure.
People can, comment and help each other. I don't come with answers. The first question was about the student bodies, student organizations. And the way I understood the first part of the question was to what extent they pose alternative practices, alternative ways of politics. In my experience, I don't talk about here, but where I was, students did a lot of good in highlighting things that people were not talking about. You know, things like fees, things like insourcing, things like the violence of the university. But in their mode of politics, was it alternative? I don't think so. I don't think so. It was traditional politics more disruptive. Traditional politics more disruptive, which is a good thing. But to claim that they were revolutionary, I think we'll be going too far. Revolutionary. Sisofunda genkani. What does that say? Is that a revolutionary statement? I'm not talking to you, my chief. So, alternative, not revolutionary, perhaps. The second thing you mentioned was the need to prioritize queer bodies. Of course, we need to prioritize multiple bodies, all bodies. And of course, we know at my universities and elsewhere, later on, there was a lot of intra-homophobia, we can call it. The marginalization of first women, but also trans people and so forth. It was a big issue. In fact, in some places, it's escalated into violence, sexual violence, within the movement. Now, of course, this is something that happened in the liberation struggle as well. So if you say, was it alternative politics? Maybe not. So I agree with you, we need to prioritize, valorize multiple bodies, but I get worried when you say we need to accommodate multiple bodies, accommodate. Who must do the accommodation? So the concept of accommodation and inclusion, we need to be careful about that. The second question was about voices. There are workers, support staff, so-called, academic staff, students, council, and so forth. Multiple voices. How do we accommodate all these voices? The first point to say is that the university is a microcosm of society, is a microcosm of a polity. In society, how do we accommodate multiple voices? There's no easy answer, but the answer is the same. The way we accommodate multiple voices in society is the way we should do it in the university. You know, one of the things that students did well was to fight for insourcing, to say workers are us and we are also workers. That was beautiful. That was really, really beautiful. But the point goes to the first thing that I mentioned. Decolonization is about democracy. Unless we can find a way to accommodate all these multiple voices, there is no democracy. We go back to the idea that university managers and academics are just imperialists who don't accommodate these multiple voices. So this is a difficult question. It's a question of political theory. I don't have easy answers, but this is something that needs to emerge from contestations. There's no blueprint. The university management cannot come and say, this is how we're going to make these platforms, create these platforms. Even before platforms are created, there must be debate about the form that they need to take. The form that they need to take. Multiple voices. But yeah, I don't have a straight answer. It comes not from one person, but from contestations. The third question was about conceptual schemas and translation. Now, this is very, very an important question, and a long-standing question, by the way. Decolonization also means valorizing our languages. Without that, there's no decolonization. We are speaking English now. Are we going to achieve anything? Maybe not. But this is a long-standing debate, and it started just after independence in Africa. You see it in debates between Ukutshintshwa on the one hand, and on the other hand, Achebe and Soyinka. Ngugi saying, we cannot decolonize our mind, we cannot talk about African literature unless we do it in our own languages. Because as Fanon teaches us, to take a language is to take a worldview. You can say you are speaking English to decolonize it, but you have already assumed certain things that colonize you. So language is very important. On the other hand, Achebe says, but how are we going to talk to each other if we don't speak in English? If our African literature is not in English. In Nigeria, they've got so many languages. In South Africa, we've got 10 languages, plus Totsital, plus Kapse, and so forth, right? And Khoisan and Kam language, and so forth. How are we going to understand each other unless we speak in English? There's a book called The Empire Writes Back. The Empire by Ashcroft. The Empire Writes Back. And here they show that English has been decolonized into Englishes, small e, different Englishes. Pidgin English, Patois in Jamaica, Creole in other places. So what we assume as English, most of the time it's been decolonized already. So there's no big English that colonizes us. Pidgin English is already a form of decolonization. The third point that you make is about translation. Translation. And now this is a very important point. Because of course, decolonization is about coexistence. It's not about the black world, creating the black world. It's about how do we decolonize so that we are part of the world with other people. It's not about retreating to our own world. And therefore we need to translate to understand each other. But a lot is lost in translation. That cannot be avoided. And there's a lot of work in this. One work is by Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who talks about the work of translation in decolonization. And the first thing is to say, some things cannot be translated, and we should live with that. And we should use those terms and not seek to translate them. Right? So we need to know that some things cannot be translated. Secondly, that some things do not want to be translated. But the last that I want to say is Saul Plaatje, in 1924, wrote a book on Proverbs. He did a good job, I think. And I think for us, that's a model. That's a model. But we can speak more about this. The fourth question, critical approaches. It is true that critical approaches are alternative theories themselves, right? But in constitutional theory, critical scholarship or critical theories, critical praxis does not move from the premise that there is colonization. It doesn't move. Its point of departure is not that there is conquest. Its point of departure is that there is subjugation of queer bodies, of black people, and so forth. They are subjugated. And therefore, we need to read the Constitution in a way that accommodates black bodies, race bodies, and so forth. Accommodate. So there will be social justice. Decolonization people move from the premise that there is conquest. And therefore, we need to decolonize society. The last thing where you see the difference between the two is that critical race, most feminism, not all feminism, queer theory does not talk about land. They don't talk about land and the need to retain the land. They don't talk about the subjugation of indigenous sovereignties. Thirdly, they don't talk about the need to valorize African culture. They don't talk about that. They don't talk about land. They don't talk about kingdoms. They don't talk about the need to valorize African culture. Those three are the fundamental pillars of decolonization. Critical scholarship is good. I'm not dissing it. I'm not dissing it. I wrote my master's thing on, no follow-ups. I wrote my master's thesis on critical race scholarship long time ago in 2010. No, I won't mention my age. Long time ago. So I'm not dissing it. I'm just drawing a difference between the two. I'm not saying it's not important. I'm saying it's not a decolonial framework. The last question was very, very important. We can decolonize, meaning that the land can come back, indigenous sovereignties can be valorized, but there can still be divisions amongst ourselves in terms of tribes. Now that is true. That is true. Decolonization needs to happen inside and outside. That's why I mentioned the need to disrupt yourself in the first place. And I mean, there's a lot to say on this. I mean, you mentioned that black people came from East Africa and came down here. Where does that come from? That's a white historiography. I mean, I'm making a separate point here. The idea that black people cascaded from Burundi and so forth, it's a white historiography that seeks to say we are all settlers. And only the Khoisan came as plants from the land. Be careful of that white historiography and what it's doing. Be careful of that. But you also mentioned Mfekani, very, very important. Very, very important that we talk about this in the context of decolonization. Let me give you one example of how it applies. Land restitution. Land restitution. People say the land that was taken from these people must be returned. But Mfekani meant that everyone was displaced. Forget about the white historiography. But in Mfekani, when Shaka Zulu moved from here up to the Congo, everyone moved. So whose original land is this piece of land? It's not very clear. It's also not very important, by the way. When people talk about the Zulus is an invention. It's not a historical group, it's an invention. When people talk about Basotho are not a historical from the beginning from God. It's an amalgamation of many things. So there is no indigenous pure culture, pure tribes. Terence Ranger wrote a fantastic book, The Invention of Tribes. So there is no this thing that I am Zulu. Come on. It's an invention. But as we say, most importantly, it creates further divisions. But also a land restitution framework that says, give the land back to Amazulu, Basotho. Is that decolonization, or is it going to lead to further balkanization of the country? What about some of us who belong to two ethnic groups? Where will we find ourselves? Not land restitution, but land reform on an equal basis.
All right. Let's take the last round for the afternoon. The last two hands. Sure. 1, 2. Okay, we'll close with you, my brother. In that order. 1, 2, 3.
Molweni, thank you for the opportunity to actually, give a perspective on the issue at hand. Doc, I must first highlight that as I stand here, I feel very oppressed, because I am compelled to speak to you in English. But of course, I understand the dynamics of us being subject of the Queen and therefore having, to toe the line. In terms of the liberal view of constitutionality, I just wanted to highlight how I loved how you distinguish it. Because what I've found that in a lot of academic writing as it relates to the decolonial project, there is a lot of liberal undertones.
Yeah.
within the actual so-called decolonial theory. So I think I was very impressed with that. And then I want to skip now to the post-colonial, your post-conquest constitution as you define it. And the first two, what needs to be done? It's the dismantlement of the state and then the dismantlement of the entrenchment of the world of difference. So now I want to take this and direct it contextually to the land question, you know, and kind of get your view on this as to what would be the view of a post-conquest constitution as it relates to the land question. You touched on it briefly, but I want you to try and go in depth. What does it mean to return the land? Who is it being returned to? As Ulikota asked, who are our people? Who are these our people? You know, so can you also touch on that? And then, second, lastly, violence, when I talk. You know, I think the definition of violence, as you highlighted, it's currently, you know, leaves a lot to be desired. I don't want to categorize it, but it leaves a lot to be desired. And I'd like to hear your perspective on how we can maybe develop our own understanding and our own conceptualization of what violence is as oppressed groups globally. And then the last one, when I talk about is the issue of social movements. Ne? I think as I descend from the podium or from the floor, I want to yeah, thank you. I want to make sure that I highlight this thing, or can there be decolonizations while locations and Bantustan still exist? Can we decolonize? Now referencing Abahlali as you had done. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I have a question because there's something that I'm sort of confused by. Oh, sorry. Oh. Your fascination with Abantu baseMjondolo, I think you mentioned about 4 points that you're fascinated by with regards to Abantu Abahlali. It's fascination. He did say it was a fascination. It is a fascination with Abantu baseMjondolo, particularly about how they opt out of systems, or they refuse to assimilate to systems that they never created initially. Now, your point was about careerist objectives, objectives of academics who want to form part of a decolonial project, but the problem is that academics are stuck in an ivory tower that makes them very disjuncted with those people, according to academics. Okay. With that context, I'm trying to understand. To be able to step out of an ivory tower, to have some sort of understanding, you need to have some experience of systems that aren't necessarily within the university system, right? However, okay, I think my question is premised on the relationship between social justice movements and ivory towers and how they could work together to collaborate to create this decolonial project that we all seek to actually manifest or to have play out. How would that play out when people who opt out of systems are doing it, yet people who are constrained or in straitjackets because of bureaucratic systems, how would that relationship look like in the context of what we're trying to do with the decolonial project?
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, Doc, let me greet you and welcome your presentation.
Thank you.
You have given us very serious intellectual intriguing points. But I got 3 short questions. It's going to be very short.
I'll drink my wine solo.
The first question, it's short and it's direct. In your understanding, Doc, what is the revolution? The second question, listening to your presentation on how you paint and how you define decolonialization, And in your presentation as well, you have mentioned the cruelties of so many systems. And in that system, you've mentioned what a lot of critical decolonialist scholars get to neglect, which is the capitalism. Now, my question to you, can the decolonization be used as the tool to try and dismantle capitalism? Is decolonization an antithesis of capitalism, or a decolonial society becomes a synthesis? The last question is, you said, and I think I will have to disagree with you on this one, Doc, but of course you will clarify me. You said, we are falling into a trap if we are going to identify ourselves as natives. And again, on the same breath, you said, the need for the recognition of a native existed when there was a settler. And as far as I can remember, there is no day where we can say the settlers which gave the existing reasons in order for us to define ourselves as native, for those settlers to active, or for those actors to live in order for us not to identify ourselves as natives anymore. It means the identification of ourselves as natives, it's as a result of until today we are still with settlers. So on what basis are you saying then we are falling into a trap of having to define ourselves as people who are rightfully Africans? And in order for us not to identify to ourselves as the people who must be prioritized within the context and the content of decolonization. Thank you very much.
So many questions. The issue of land, that's an entire seminar, not even a talk, a seminar for all of us. But my view is that, and there's a short article of mine online. The title is whether amendment to the Constitution is a decolonial project or does it further colonization? And I argue that amendment of the Constitution furthers colonization. You can see what you can read to see what argument I'm making. I'm saying that the land must be shared, but I'm not talking about Freedom Charter here. I'm saying the land must be shared. At present, 80% of the land is owned by white people. White people constitute 8% of the population. That cannot be. There cannot be 80% of the land being taken by 8% of the population. Cannot be. It's unfair. It's a historical injustice. But most importantly, it's a recipe for war. There's no doubt about that. It's a ticking time bomb. There's no doubt about that. So the land must be shared. But I am not for restitution, as I said. If restitution means my family was displaced in the Free State, my family was displaced here, give us back this land. I'm saying such a scheme leads to balkanization once again. You know what I mean? It leads to balkanization once again. Now people say, but those people who were displaced, they still live with a memory of offense. Something needs to be done. What do? I think I support a land reform program where the land is shared equitably. And of course it will mean more black people have got more land than other groups of people. Some of us don't want land. I don't want land. I just want to teach and DJ, so I don't want land. Those who want land, those who know what they're going to do with the land, they must get the land. But I'm not for land restitution. But you are quite right. Most decolonial scholarship is liberal because it dodges this land question. It's a liberal scheme. It talks about metaphors. It's a game just like the game that is played by postmodernism. You just played verbal gymnastics. So you're quite right. It's a liberal undertone. The question of violence, what was the question there? What is the definition? No, I was saying, you know, during Feast Must Fall, everything was categorized as violence. If students walk in here and they take away the mic and say, all of you get out, it was said it's violence. And people could go to jail, by the way. So I'm saying we need to differentiate between violence and disruption. Universities always say we welcome contestation, we welcome protest, but their definition of protest is very narrow. You must just walk around here carrying a placard. You know, you must just chant. And also I'm saying there is a violence of the university, exclusion, language, sexism, homophobia, racism. That's violence. Use of the bouncers. So violence, we need to expand it. And there's a lot of debate here. 1, On Violence is a title by Hannah Arendt. 2, On Violence by Slavoj Žižek. 3, On Violence by Fanon. All of them defining violence from a different perspective. Hannah Arendt's definition is incorrect. You can leave that out. Social movements and Abahlali. What was the question there? Let me combine it with that question. The relationship between academics and social movements. So in 2006, I wrote that paper, Beyond the Ivory Tower, saying academics must engage with academics. But in 2007, I changed my mind a bit and talked about social movements caught between a rock and a hard place. The rock being state repression. The hard place being captured by academics. Academics come, they give you T-shirt, they print for you, but they want to have a bigger voice in the movement. They don't want internal democracy. So that relationship is very, very difficult. We've seen it in South Africa, where academics capture social movements, not to work with them, but to extract research from them. We see it a lot, it's been written about. So it's very, very, it is true that academics, when they go beyond the ivory tower, they can come there with colonial attitudes, especially our Marxist friends. Right? So that can happen. Natives. What is revolution? It's a long story. I'm not going to answer that now. What is a revolution? But revolution means something different. Revolution doesn't mean feast must fall, we therefore can study in the university. Of course, it's an important component, access. But if access means assimilation, then that's not revolution. We've not achieved a revolution. If in our modes of politics, we reprise patriarchy, homophobia within the movement, in our doing the revolution, it's not revolution. So things like that, but the definition of revolution is here, is quite wide. Decolonization must end capitalism. It must end capitalism. That's why Steve Biko, when he was interviewed and they asked him, you talk about black consciousness and so forth, but what kind of economic system? And he said socialism. Leopold Senghor, socialism. Fanon, socialism. Radical feminism. Radical feminism, not just relations between genders, but the end of capitalism. There is no decolonization without capitalism. But you're quite right. Most decolonial scholarship really facilitate capitalism. We want to write more books so you can reach, you can be cited, you can be promoted. We promote a neoliberal university. So there's no decolonization without the fall of capitalism. What comes next? I don't know. What comes after that? The question of natives. We were not natives before the settler arrives. You agree with that, right? But I seem to understand you and I agree with you that we can use the concept of native strategically, not tactically for now, as an antithesis You know, people often forget that Biko was not fighting for a black world. Biko was not fighting for a black world, right? Biko said, I'm fighting for a world where there shall be no black, there shall be no white. Biko. But you are saying today, when the thesis is white supremacy, the antithesis must be black consciousness. The antithesis, it must